January 7, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The war room was quiet when Dwight Eisenhower finished reading the transcript. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He sat still, holding several typed pages taken from a press conference held that morning in Belgium. His hands trembled slightly, not from uncertainty, from controlled anger. The document summarized the remarks of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In it, Montgomery described the Battle of the Bulge as a campaign he had personally handled. He stated that American forces north of the German penetration had been disorganized, that command had been confused, and that British leadership had been required to restore order. He implied that without his intervention, the American army might have failed. Eisenhower had not authorized the press conference. He had not been consulted on its content, and he understood immediately what the words meant beyond their surface. They were not an operational briefing. They were a political statement. Within minutes, Eisenhower summoned his senior American commanders. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. The remarks were not merely inaccurate. They were insulting. They publicly reassigned credit for American sacrifice. They suggested American incompetence at the moment of the largest and bloodiest battle the United States Army had yet fought in Europe. Eisenhower knew the consequence if this was allowed to stand. Bradley would resign. Patton would follow. The American command structure would fracture. The alliance itself would become unstable, not because of German pressure, but because one Allied commander had chosen to speak alone. Eisenhower picked up the telephone and dictated a message to his staff. He ordered a draft prepared for the combined chiefs of staff. Its purpose was not to explain. It was to force a decision. The message stated that the existing command arrangement could no longer function. Either Montgomery would be removed, or Eisenhower himself would step aside. This was not a threat made in anger. It was a conclusion reached calmly. The decision had already been made. At that moment, the military situation itself was not in dispute. The opportunity Eisenhower had acted on in December had been real, limited, and temporary, and it had already passed by the time Montgomery spoke. When the German offensive broke through the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, it did not create a strategic collapse. It created a geographic problem. The German thrust drove a deep wedge between American formations, stretching communications and isolating command posts. What it did not do was destroy the American armies facing it. Their units remained intact. Their logistics, though disrupted, were not severed. Their reserves still existed. Eisenhower's decision to shift command of the northern sector to Montgomery was based on proximity, not confidence. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the threatened area north of the penetration. Lines of communication to Bradley's headquarters were strained. Radio contact was unreliable. The decision was made to simplify control during a crisis, not to replace failed leadership. Militarily, the task was defensive and finite. Hold the northern shoulder. Prevent a German breakout toward Antwerp. Stabilize the line until American counteroffensives could be coordinated from both flanks. There was no expectation of a British-led decisive maneuver. There was no plan for Montgomery to win the battle. The Germans were already operating at the limits of their logistical reach. The decisive element of the campaign lay elsewhere. To the south, American forces were maneuvering freely. Patton's Third Army was not broken, delayed, or disorganized beyond recovery. Within days, it was already pivoting north, executing one of the largest operational redeployments of the war under winter conditions. That movement, not the northern containment, would determine the outcome. By early January, the German offensive had failed. Fuel shortages, attrition, and Allied air power had ended any realistic German chance of reaching their objectives. The American armies north and south of the Bulge were closing in. The battle was no longer about survival. It was about restoring the front and resuming the advance into Germany. From a military perspective, Montgomery's role had been important but bounded. He had performed competent defensive management. He had not reversed a collapse, because no collapse had occurred. He had not rescued destroyed armies, because none had been destroyed. He had overseen a holding action during a temporary command arrangement that was already being unwound. This was the critical point. The opportunity had been narrow, technical, and already complete. There was no vacuum of leadership left to fill. There was no ongoing emergency requiring public explanation. The battlefield had stabilized. The operational narrative belonged to Eisenhower alone. In that context, the press conference added nothing to the military situation. It did not clarify plans. It did not support morale at the front. It did not deter the enemy. It addressed only perception. And it did so at a moment when unity mattered more than attribution. Militarily, silence would have preserved the alliance without cost. Speech did the opposite. The opportunity Eisenhower had managed was over. What remained was the political structure that made further operations possible. Montgomery's remarks did not exploit a battlefield opening. They exploited a temporary command arrangement that no longer existed. Montgomery did not stumble into this moment unprepared. He had been thinking about it for weeks. From the first hours of the German offensive, he had formed a clear internal assessment of what was happening and, more importantly, of how it should be remembered. His focus was not on improvisation at the front, but on structure, sequence, and control. He believed that wars were won by deliberate management, not by reactive maneuver. And he believed that he, more than any other commander in Northwest Europe, understood how to impose order on chaos. When Eisenhower transferred temporary authority over the northern sector, Montgomery interpreted the move through his own framework. He did not see it as a geographic expedient. He saw it as validation. In his mind, the crisis confirmed what he had long argued, that American command culture was too fluid, too decentralized, too tolerant of risk. The Germans had exploited that looseness. He would correct it. Montgomery's method was predictable and disciplined. He shortened lines. He insisted on clear boundaries. He prioritized defense over initiative. Units were repositioned to form a solid shoulder. Reserves were placed deliberately behind the line, and contingencies were written down rather than improvised. None of this was reckless, and none of it was novel. It was consistent with how he had fought since North Africa. What mattered more was how he recorded these actions internally. Montgomery kept careful notes. He spoke to his staff in declarative terms. He framed the situation as one he had taken in hand. He did not describe collaboration. He described correction. His chief of staff, Freddie de Gingand, understood the danger. He had spent years translating Montgomery's certainty into language that others could tolerate. He warned repeatedly that American sensitivities were raw, that casualties had been heavy, and that any public narrative would have to be handled by Eisenhower himself. Montgomery listened, but he did not accept the premise. In his mind, the warning signs pointed in the opposite direction. The British public expected clarity. London wanted reassurance that British forces were not peripheral. Churchill wanted evidence that British command still mattered in a coalition increasingly dominated by American manpower and American resources. Montgomery believed that silence would allow others to define events in ways that diminished his role and Britain's standing. He also believed he was protected. His record at El Alamein, his symbolic value at home, and Churchill's personal backing had insulated him repeatedly. He had survived the failure of Market Garden. He had survived months of open disagreement with Eisenhower over strategy. He had survived private American resentment without consequence. Each episode reinforced the same conclusion. He was indispensable. By early January, Montgomery's preparation had shifted from military contingency to narrative control. He reviewed the sequence of events as he saw them. German breakthrough, American disruption, British assumption of control, stabilization, Allied recovery. It was a clean arc, and it placed him at its center. He did not deny American bravery. He simply subordinated it. Sacrifice existed in his account, but leadership belonged elsewhere. The distinction mattered to him. In his mind, courage without direction was insufficient. Order was decisive. The press conference was therefore not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of a settled interpretation. Montgomery believed he was clarifying history before it hardened. He believed that if he spoke first, the record would reflect his version of events. What he misjudged was not the facts on the ground, but the limits of tolerance above him. He underestimated how thin Eisenhower's margin already was. He misunderstood how much American commanders had already accepted for the sake of unity. And he failed to recognize that preparation for battle does not translate into preparation for coalition politics. Montgomery entered the press room convinced that discipline and confidence would carry the day, as they always had. He had prepared his remarks carefully. He had chosen his words deliberately. He believed he was being precise. He was not prepared for how those words would land once they left his control. The reaction in Washington and at Supreme Headquarters followed a pattern Eisenhower had seen before, but never at this scale. Montgomery's remarks did not create anger in isolation. They activated pressures that had been building for months beneath the surface of the alliance. The American command structure had absorbed repeated slights in silence. Market Garden had failed after consuming American airborne divisions. Strategic disagreements had been handled privately. Public credit had been shared generously. What Montgomery had done on January 7th crossed an unspoken boundary. For the American generals, this was not about pride. It was about legitimacy. Bradley had commanded American forces continuously since Normandy. He had taken responsibility for defeats as well as advances. He had accepted Eisenhower's December decision because it served operational necessity. The press conference reframed that necessity as incompetence. It implied that American command authority had failed when it mattered most. Bradley did not argue. He did not negotiate. He informed Eisenhower that he could not continue under those conditions. His resignation was not a threat designed to extract concessions. It was a statement of fact. If Montgomery remained publicly unchallenged, Bradley's authority with his own officers would be irreparably damaged. Patton's position was even simpler. He had executed the decisive maneuver of the campaign. He had moved his army under extreme conditions, relieved Bastogne, and driven into the German flank. Montgomery's account reduced that effort to a supporting role in a British-managed victory. Patton made it clear that if Bradley left, he would leave as well. The American command would collapse downward, not upward. Eisenhower understood that this was not a personnel dispute. It was a structural crisis. Removing Bradley and Patton would not simply change names on an organizational chart. It would shatter confidence throughout the American armies. Officers who had watched their leaders absorb public blame while delivering results would draw their own conclusions. At the same time, Eisenhower also understood the political constraints operating in the opposite direction. Montgomery was not merely a field commander. He was a symbol. Churchill had invested heavily in him, both publicly and privately. British domestic morale was tied to Montgomery's image as proof that Britain still mattered in a war increasingly fought with American resources. Removing him would not be received as a military correction. It would be interpreted as American domination. The alliance's formal structures reinforced this tension. Eisenhower held supreme command in name, but not in isolation. Major decisions were subject to combined approval. Churchill had direct access to Roosevelt. Any public dismissal of Montgomery could be appealed immediately, turning a command decision into a diplomatic confrontation at the highest level. Eisenhower had navigated these constraints before by delaying, deflecting, or absorbing friction. This time, delay was no longer an option. Allowing Montgomery's narrative to stand would signal to American officers that their leadership was expendable for the sake of appearances. Removing Montgomery outright risked destabilizing the British government's confidence in the coalition. The overruling came through mechanism rather than emotion. Eisenhower did not issue a public rebuke. He did not counter Montgomery in the press. Instead, he escalated the issue vertically. He drafted a message to the combined chiefs that framed the situation as untenable rather than offensive. The language was deliberate. The command structure, he wrote, could not function under current conditions. He then attached himself to the outcome. If the chiefs believed Montgomery's continued presence was essential, Eisenhower would step aside. This was not grandstanding. It was an acknowledgement of reality. Supreme command depended on consent as much as authority. Without the confidence of American commanders, the position was meaningless. This move forced every institutional actor to confront the true cost of Montgomery's behavior. Churchill now faced a choice between protecting a symbol and preserving the alliance's operational integrity. The British chiefs had to consider whether Montgomery's public standing was worth risking American leadership at the front. Washington had to decide whether unity required sacrifice, and from whom. The overruling did not yet remove Montgomery. It suspended him in place, stripped of momentum, while decisions were made above his level. His words had triggered forces larger than himself, forces he could no longer control. The system did what systems do under stress. It moved to contain damage, not to assign blame. And in that process, Montgomery's position shifted from protected asset to liability. The battlefield had been stabilized weeks earlier. Now it was the command structure that was at risk. The consequences unfolded quickly, not at the front, but across desks, telephones, and private rooms where the war was actually managed. Within hours of Eisenhower's message reaching higher channels, the immediate risk became clear. The German army was retreating. The front was stabilizing. Yet the Western alliance was closer to fracture than it had been at any point since Normandy. The cause was not defeat, but attribution. Churchill moved first because he had the most to lose. Britain no longer dominated the coalition militarily. By January 1945, American manpower, production, and logistics carried the war in Europe. What Britain retained was influence, and that influence depended on symbolism as much as performance. Montgomery embodied that symbolism. Losing him publicly would be read at home as subordination, not correction. Churchill understood Eisenhower's position immediately. He did not dispute the substance of the American anger. He did not defend Montgomery's phrasing. What he feared was timing. A public rupture days after the bloodiest battle fought by American forces would poison the alliance at the moment victory was finally in sight. The solution he pursued was containment. Not vindication. Not punishment. Containment. Churchill telephoned Eisenhower personally. The tone was urgent but measured. He asked for time. Not weeks. Not days. Hours. He promised to deal with Montgomery himself if Eisenhower would delay formal action. The request was not framed as a favor. It was framed as a necessity. At the same time, Montgomery's own headquarters began to understand the danger. Freddie de Gingand, who had seen crises before, moved quickly. He did not debate interpretation. He did not argue facts. He flew to Montgomery and told him what Eisenhower had already done. The message was direct. The dismissal order existed. It was written. It was real. And it would not be stopped by argument. Montgomery did not respond immediately. For years, consequences had stopped short of him. This time, they had not. The insulation he had relied on was thinning rapidly. The press conference, which he had expected to clarify his role, had instead stripped him of protection. The realization mattered. Not because Montgomery reconsidered the battle, but because he finally understood the chain of command he had tested too often. Eisenhower did not need Churchill's approval to lose his own position. And if Eisenhower left, Montgomery's career would not survive the fallout. The letter Montgomery wrote was unprecedented for him. It did not defend phrasing. It did not restate facts. It conceded error. He acknowledged that the press conference had been inappropriate. He praised American soldiers explicitly. He affirmed Eisenhower's authority without qualification. The content mattered less than the act. Montgomery did not apologize often. When he did, it was because the alternative was worse. Eisenhower received the letter without comment. He did not respond publicly. He did not retract his earlier message. He allowed the machinery around him to slow, not reverse. The dismissal order was not signed. It was set aside. The alliance remained intact. But the consequence did not end there. From that moment forward, Montgomery's position changed in ways that were not announced. Eisenhower did not confront him again. He did not reprimand him in writing. He did something more durable. He reduced his relevance. Montgomery would no longer command American troops. That decision was final and private. Any future operational arrangements would ensure that British formations remained under British control and American armies under American command, regardless of geography. The flexibility that had allowed temporary reassignment in December would not be repeated. Strategically, Montgomery's influence narrowed. His long-standing argument for a single concentrated thrust into Germany under his direction was finished. Eisenhower's broad front approach would continue. Resources would be allocated across multiple advances, denying any one commander decisive primacy. Montgomery remained in uniform. He remained visible. He remained a field marshal. But he was no longer central. He had traded authority for survival. The political cleanup followed the same pattern. Churchill stood before Parliament and reframed the narrative explicitly. The Battle of the Bulge, he said, had been an American battle. The victory belonged to American arms. British forces had supported, but not supplanted, that effort. This was not generosity. It was repair. Churchill absorbed the embarrassment domestically to preserve the alliance internationally. Montgomery did not contradict him. Silence replaced certainty. At the front, soldiers continued to advance. German resistance collapsed under pressure that no longer required public explanation. The war resumed its course, but the structure above it had been altered. What followed traced directly back to January 7th. Montgomery would finish the war without further controversy, but also without further initiative. His role became procedural rather than decisive. He executed orders. He did not shape them. Eisenhower, for his part, emerged with his authority clarified. He had demonstrated that supreme command meant more than mediation. It meant drawing a line when cohesion was threatened from within. He did not do so publicly. He did so effectively. The consequence was not a dismissal, but a demotion in everything but rank. Montgomery's press conference had not cost him his job. It had cost him his future. The battlefield recorded no immediate change. Casualty figures did not shift. Timelines did not pause. But the command environment hardened. Words were now understood as weapons that could damage alliances as surely as any enemy attack. The German army would be defeated in months. The alliance would hold. But one of its most prominent commanders would never again be allowed to speak for the whole. That was the price of January 7th. And it was paid quietly. The post-war record closed the case without drama, because by then the outcome was already settled. Eisenhower never publicly described how close Montgomery came to dismissal. He had no incentive to. Victory required unity in memory as well as in fact. His memoirs framed the episode carefully, emphasizing coalition management rather than confrontation. Montgomery's name appeared without condemnation, but also without the authority it once carried. What did emerge over time, through correspondence, diaries, and declassified memoranda, was a consistent pattern. January 7th marked a turning point not in command charts, but in trust. After the press conference, Eisenhower's staff treated Montgomery differently. Requests were scrutinized. Strategic proposals were logged, not embraced. The informal latitude Montgomery had once enjoyed disappeared. Where he had previously argued strategy directly with Eisenhower, he was now routed through formal channels. The distinction was subtle, but decisive. Bradley remained. Patton remained. Their confidence in Eisenhower hardened into loyalty, not because he had favored them, but because he had defended the legitimacy of American command without publicly humiliating an ally. That balance mattered. It set the tone for the final months of the war. Montgomery, by contrast, never recovered his momentum. He continued to command effectively within his sector, but no longer shaped the campaign's direction. His post-war writings avoided the press conference almost entirely. When he addressed the Bulge, he emphasized coordination rather than control, as though rewriting his own emphasis retroactively. British official histories followed the same line. The episode was acknowledged, but softened. The language focused on misunderstanding, not ego. On necessity, not rivalry. The absence of detail was itself a conclusion. Churchill's papers revealed the anxiety more clearly. He regarded the incident as one of the most dangerous internal crises of the war, not because of Montgomery's words, but because of their timing. He understood that by 1945, Britain no longer set the terms of coalition leadership. It negotiated them. January 7th exposed that reality in a way no battlefield defeat had. In American records, the lesson was internalized differently. Eisenhower's authority after the war rested not on tactical brilliance, but on political steadiness. His handling of Montgomery became a case study at West Point in coalition command, not as a triumph, but as a warning. Authority could be lost without a shot fired. Montgomery's reputation settled into contradiction. In Britain, he remained a symbol of resilience and preparation. Abroad, particularly in American accounts, he became associated with rigidity and self-importance. The divergence reflected not competing facts, but competing needs. No tribunal ever reviewed the incident. No formal reprimand was issued. There was no record of punishment because punishment would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have reopened wounds better left closed. What survived instead was alignment. After January 1945, no Allied commander again attempted to define the war unilaterally. Public statements were coordinated. Credit was distributed deliberately. Silence became policy. The documents show no reconciliation between Eisenhower and Montgomery, only coexistence. They worked together until the war ended, exchanged necessary correspondence, and parted without resolution. That, too, was telling. History often remembers battles as turning points. This one was not. It changed nothing at the front, but it fixed the hierarchy behind it. When the war ended, Eisenhower rose to global prominence. Montgomery returned home decorated but constrained. Their trajectories diverged quietly, just as their conflict had been resolved quietly. The record leaves no doubt. Montgomery was not nearly dismissed because he failed militarily. He was nearly dismissed because he misunderstood the nature of power in a coalition war. And once that misunderstanding was exposed, it was never corrected again. The record closes on a simple conclusion. Bernard Montgomery was not nearly removed because he lost a battle. He was nearly removed because he confused temporary authority with permanent ownership. He treated a coalition emergency as personal validation and spoke accordingly. That choice mattered more than any movement of troops. Dwight Eisenhower did not act out of anger. He acted out of necessity. The alliance could absorb failure. It could not absorb public fracture. By January 1945, American forces bore the weight of the war in Europe. Their commanders could not remain credible if their sacrifices were reframed as rescue operations conducted by others. Eisenhower understood something Montgomery did not. Supreme command in a coalition is not exercised through brilliance or seniority. It is exercised through restraint. The moment restraint fails, authority becomes fragile. Montgomery survived because the system intervened. Churchill contained the damage. An apology was extracted. The rupture was sealed before it became irreversible. But survival came at a cost that never appeared on paper. After January 7th, Montgomery no longer shaped Allied strategy. He executed it. He no longer spoke for the alliance. He spoke only for himself, and rarely. His rank remained. His influence did not. Eisenhower emerged with his authority clarified. He demonstrated that unity was not maintained by indulgence alone. It was maintained by defining limits and enforcing them quietly. He protected the alliance not by choosing sides, but by forcing the system to choose coherence over symbolism. No medals changed hands because of this episode. No citations mention it. Yet it was one of the most consequential command decisions of the war, precisely because it left no visible scar. The German army was defeated by force of arms. The Allied command was preserved by force of judgment. That is the closed record. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped the war behind closed doors, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel.